The crystal stage lights of the Harmonique Theatre in Boston shimmered across the polished surface of the Steinway & Sons D274 grand piano, casting reflections like distant stars. Inside, hundreds of guests in tuxedos and silk gowns whispered and sipped champagne, their laughter weaving through the echoes of high culture. Tonight was the closed rehearsal for the prestigious International Harmony Gala, where only the elite of the elite gathered. No mistakes were tolerated. No experiments allowed. And then a girl stepped onto the stage. Alone. She didn't wear satin or diamonds. She didn't glide. She felt her way forward, her white cane tapping gently against the hardwood floor. Each tap was a question. Am I allowed here? Am I safe? And yet, with each uncertain step, she answered those questions herself. Yes. Yes, I belong. Her name was Ayana Bell. 15. Blind since birth. Skin dark as mahogany, eyes clouded white. She wore a plain black dress and no makeup. There was no introduction, no name displayed on a projector screen. Just a shadow crossing into the light. A few murmurs started in the crowd. Confused looks. Was this a mistake? A new intern? And then, get her off the stage. The words cracked through the air like a whip. They came from a man seated in the third row, now rising to his feet. Nathaniel Royce, the frozen heart of American classical music. A pianist with 5 Grammys, a Kennedy Center honor, and an ego the size of the theater itself. He stepped forward, voice full of venom cloaked in velvet. She's blind. And black. She's going to ruin that $150,000 Steinway. This is not a community charity recital. Silence followed. Some guests chuckled. Others shifted uncomfortably. No one interrupted him. Ayana didn't flinch. Her fingers trembled slightly on her cane, but her spine straightened. She turned her clouded eyes in the direction of the voice, then slowly reached forward and found the edge of the piano. With the care of someone touching a memory, she lowered herself onto the bench. Nathaniel moved as if to lunge forward, but the event director gently restrained him. Let her play, he whispered. It's just rehearsal. Nathaniel scoffed, waving a hand. Let the press see how this ends. Ayana sat, her breath quiet but deep. She placed her cane down beside her like a sword being sheathed. Then she laid her hands on the keys. No one breathed. No one expected anything. She played. The first note was soft, so soft it felt like a breath caught between grief and hope. Then another note. Then a third, rising like dawn after a night too long. The hall, which seconds earlier had been full of discomfort, fell into reverent silence. Because it was not music. Not exactly. It was memory. It was heartbeat. It was survival. The notes didn't follow any sheet music known to the audience. That was because Ayana wasn't playing to impress. She was playing the only language the world had never tried to take from her. 2 years earlier, Ayana had stepped off a social services van in Hartford, Connecticut. Her suitcase was cracked. Her braille reader barely worked. Her cane had been broken twice and taped back together. The sign outside the building read, Eastbrook Conservatory of Music, a place where the children of senators, Pulitzer-winning composers, and oil barons studied Chopin before they learned cursive. Ayana wasn't a student. Not really. She had been placed in a pilot program called Silent Observer, a fancy name for, you're allowed in the building but not in the room. She wasn't given a teacher. Or a piano. Or sheet music. She had her ears. She had her mind. And she had something no one at Eastbrook expected. Faith in sound. Every day she sat outside room 2B, where Professor Harold McCain taught advanced harmony. She memorized his lectures by listening through the crack in the door. She learned which students tapped their shoes on beat. She mapped out chord progressions by listening to them over and over. In her tiny dorm room, a storage closet converted into living quarters, she would run her fingers along the wall and hum what she remembered. She traced rhythms on her own skin. She practiced cadences in her breath. And no one noticed her. Until one night. Rain fell against the old windows of Eastbrook, blurring the night into smeared shadows. McCain stepped into the hallway after his lecture and froze. Ayana was there, cross-legged on the floor, her fingers dancing silently in the air. Are you visualizing the fugue? He asked. She didn't jump. She only nodded. I think, if the A minor starts here, she whispered, tapping her knee, then the resolution won't feel like an escape but like forgiveness. McCain sat beside her, eyes misting. Don't apologize, he said. Play it right. From that night on he met her secretly. Not in the classrooms, those were off limits, but in the basement where an old, out-of-tune upright piano sat forgotten. He taught her not by sheet music but by story. A fugue, he said once, is a man chasing his own shadow. A diminished chord isn't always sorrow. Sometimes it's hope trying to disguise itself. She listened not with her ears but with her soul. She didn't learn by repetition. She learned by feeling. He tapped her wrist to teach rhythm. Tapped her shoulders for tempo. Tapped her spine to teach tension and release. He once told her, D minor is the sound of waiting for something that might never come. She replied, then I've lived in D minor all my life. McCain submitted her name, without a student ID, without a photo, without a sponsor, for an elite audition showcase. She was given a 7:45 a.m. slot, in a side room, with an old piano, and one judge who never asked her name. She played Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor from memory. When she finished, the judge said nothing. Scribbled a note. The next day she received an email. Thank you for your participation. You have not been selected. No feedback. No reason. But something happened that neither she nor the judge saw. The janitor, Mr. Richard, a quiet man with salt and pepper hair, had watched from the hallway. He'd cleaned stages where legends had played. But what he heard that morning made him cry. He took out his phone, filmed the last few minutes, uploaded it to an old classical music forum. Title: Blind Black Girl Rejected by Conservatory Plays Rachmaninoff from Memory. No hashtags. No clickbait. But 24 hours later, it had 30,000 views. Then 300,000. Then 1 million. The video continued spreading. No publicist. No marketing. No money behind it. Just raw emotion captured in poor resolution. Just 3 minutes of a girl no one knew, playing a piece that millions had heard, but never quite like that. The description under the video read only, she doesn't see the keys, but she hears what most people forgot. It wasn't Ayanna's face that captivated the world. It was her sound. Her unpolished, unrehearsed, undirected sound, born from rejection, shaped by survival, and delivered like a whisper too powerful to ignore. A tweet from an Argentinian pianist with one hand went viral. I haven't cried over music in 10 years. She broke me. A Berlin blogger reposted it with the caption, if Eastbrook didn't see a future in this girl, then maybe the problem isn't in her eyes, it's in their vision. A deaf artist in Japan shared the video with subtitles written from memory, captioned, she doesn't need to hear perfectly. She doesn't need to see. She made me feel something I never knew music could. In 72 hours, the video hit 3.1 million views. And then, the moment came. The International Music Institute, a body responsible for the World Harmony Gala, posted one single tweet that made headlines around the globe. We watched the video. We want Ayana Bell to open the World Harmony Gala this year. No qualifications. No formal resume. No request for audition tapes. Just, we saw. We heard. We want her. Back at Eastbrook, chaos broke out behind closed doors. Professor Clarence Langford, head of the piano department, and self-proclaimed heir to the Royce method, called an emergency board meeting. His voice shook with restrained rage. This is getting out of control. This online phenomenon. It's not trained. It's not refined. It's instinctual. We don't send instinct to Crescendo Hall. Sophie Travers, the school's PR director, stayed silent. She simply turned her laptop to display the gala's announcement. Ayanna's name in bold. Langford exploded, slamming his palm on the table. If she performs, who in their right mind would follow her? No one responded. Because deep down they all knew no one could. Elsewhere, in a tiny hotel near downtown Boston, Ayanna sat cross-legged by the window. She had no team. No press agent. No stylist. Just an old wooden flute and a man with gray hair beside her. Professor Harold McCain had retired from Eastbrook quietly, the same way he had served for 40 years, without fanfare. But for this he made an exception. He held out a simple black dress. No sequins. No embellishment. Ayanna smiled, fingers tracing the hem. It doesn't need to sparkle, she whispered. It just needs the right sound. McCain smiled. Tonight, the world listens differently. She tilted her head. Not with their eyes. Not with their pride. With the place they forgot to use, their hearts. The Crescendo Hall in New York was filled to capacity that evening. Diplomats. Music legends. Critics. The world's most recognized faces in the arts. All waited for the opening act. Backstage, Nathaniel Royce stood stiffly, arms folded. He stared at the running order, jaw tight. Ayana Bell. Opening performance. He would follow her. And he hated it. His voice was calm but dangerously low. This is a gala, he said. Not an emotional circus. She's being used as a symbol. His assistant, Judith, tried to soften him. 30 million views, Mr. Royce. She's not a trend. She's a phenomenon. Royce turned toward the artistic director, Gerard Monroe, a refined Frenchman whose name had graced White House programs. I demand the order be reversed, Royce said coldly. I refuse to follow a blind child. Gerard met his gaze without flinching. Then don't perform at all. But she opens. Royce froze. Not in protest. In fear. Because for the first time in decades he wasn't the one with power. Backstage, Ayanna stood by herself, barefoot, her hand resting on her old wooden flute. The same one her mother had used to sing lullabies before cancer took her away when Ayanna was 3. McCain adjusted the collar of her dress, then handed her the flute case. No one can speak for you, Ayanna. But tonight, the whole world is ready to listen. Ayanna smiled softly. I don't need to be heard by everyone. Just, someone. Then the lights dimmed. The announcer's voice echoed through the crescendo hall. Ladies and gentlemen, opening tonight's Gala of Human Harmony from the United States. Ayana Bell. No orchestra played her in. No music heralded her. Just the sound of a white cane tapping softly on hardwood, each step landing like a heartbeat. The curtains parted. She didn't wave. She didn't bow. She sat at the Steinway & Sons D274. The same model Royce had once said she'd ruin. She didn't play Bach. She didn't play Rachmaninoff. She didn't play anything that had been written. She composed, right there, in front of the world. The first note rang out, a long, aching G, drawn out like a child's cry in a crowd. Then came broken chords, stitched together by memory and grief. The left hand held deep, stormy defiance. The right, a fragile hope trying to reach a mother long gone. 3 minutes in, no one moved. Technicians froze. The conductor forgot his cue. Royce stopped breathing. Because what she played wasn't a melody. It was a reckoning. She didn't ask for applause. She demanded silence, and the world gave it to her. When the final note faded, she lifted her head, and the audience didn't cheer. They stood. Not in admiration. An apology. McCain, watching from the wings, didn't clap either. He simply whispered. She was never invited to speak. But she made the world stand up to listen. The next morning, headlines across the globe ignited like fire through dry brush. The blind girl who changed music forever. Ayana Bell didn't just perform, she transformed the stage. No conductor, no sheet music, no eyesight, just truth. Critics known for dissecting performances with surgical cruelty found themselves reaching for words that didn't sound hollow. One wrote in the Times, "What I heard last night cannot be taught in conservatories." Because what she played wasn't a piece, it was pain sculpted into melody. The Gala's official performance video was uploaded to its YouTube channel before dawn. By noon it had surpassed 5 million views. By evening, producers from Silver Sound Records, a label that had turned prodigies into legends, arrived at Ayanna's hotel suite. They brought flowers. A 30-page gold-embossed contract. A promise to launch her to international stardom. Ayanna didn't even look at the paperwork. She asked only one question. Do you know what a prelude means? The rep blinked. An introduction? Ayanna nodded. Then what I played last night wasn't the story, just the beginning. And I'm not ready for the middle yet. She closed the door. No cameras. No selfies. No press releases. Just silence. The next day Ayanna was gone. The hotel manager reported she left at 4 a.m. with Professor McCain, a small suitcase, her flute, and a train ticket to Salzburg. Where she went was unknown. But what followed wasn't. Letters started arriving at Eastbrook Conservatory, handwritten, typed, sometimes barely legible. They weren't from agents or reviewers. They came from everywhere else. A prisoner who had been in solitary confinement for 17 years. A 10-year-old girl with terminal cancer. A deaf boy learning piano by feeling vibrations through the floor. All said the same thing. She played like she had heard my silence. Ayanna never replied with words. She responded with music. Not emailed files. Not digital tracks. She mailed handwritten sheet music. Old silk paper. Brown ink. Notation that defied traditional structure. Each piece addressed not with names but with titles like, The Breath You Left Behind. For the Wall That Remembers. When lullabies go silent. They were impossible to reproduce, and yet when people played them, even imperfectly, something happened. A mother grieving her son played The Breath You Left Behind. The final note lingered like an exhale that hadn't left her chest in months. She sat still, not crying, only whispering, You're still here. A prisoner played the wall remembers by tapping his fingers on his metal bunk. The rhythm mirrored how he used to knock to remember his mother's piano. And he cried. Not because of regret but because someone had heard him. Meanwhile, Eastbrook Conservatory, the very place that had once denied Ayanna access to a classroom, was in crisis. Petitions with over 30,000 signatures flooded in from alumni, musicians and educators worldwide. They demanded answers. Why was Ayana Bell rejected? Why was her audition scheduled at 7:45 a.m., in a storage room with no panel? Why was her talent dismissed? The conservatory offered no formal apology. But something changed. Under pressure, they announced a new wing would be established. The Bell Wing, a space for the unheard. It would not bear her statue. Nor her portrait. Only a courtyard. Empty. At its center, a smooth white stone inscribed in Braille. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is where everything waits to be heard. Ayanna didn't attend the Bell Wing inauguration. But a blind student named Noor found a folded sheet of music taped to her locker. No title. No composer's name. Just one line written at the bottom. For those who were never chosen, but still chose to speak. Noor performed it at graduation. The entire audience stood, not for spectacle but in understanding. In the months that followed, stories spread, not in newspapers but in whispers. In northern Canada, a blind girl was seen teaching an autistic child rhythm by walking in circles with rice under their shoes. In Ghana, a new drum rhythm spread called the Ayanna Pulse. Villagers claimed it came from the rhythm of a girl's footsteps they once heard in the dark before sunrise. In Portugal, a boy found a score under a bench titled, For Those Still Waiting. In Japan, a nursing home caretaker found sheet music under the pillow of a woman who had just passed. Read. For those who once sang, but no one listened. None of the pieces were ever sold. None of them registered. None copyrighted. They belonged to no one. Because Ayanna had become everywhere. Back in Boston, Royce, the man who had once shouted her off stage, no longer performed. He lived alone, practicing the same melody over and over on a piano that no longer shined. A score sat above the keys. Written in Braille. He couldn't read it. But he played it every morning. Sometimes crying. Sometimes smiling. Always listening. One night, at a seminar, he stood in the back and asked Harold McCain, "If I rewrote every note I ever performed just to let one girl feel accepted, is it too late?" Harold simply said, "It's never too late, if you write with what you lost." The Artisan Prize was only awarded once a decade. Recipients had included giants, world-renowned conductors, symphonic composers, and virtuosos who'd shaped entire generations of music. The selection committee, based in London under the Royal Council of Arts, deliberated for months before sending one envelope. A thick parchment, edged in gold, sealed with red wax bearing the mark of an ancient harp. The courier arrived in a remote village in the Austrian Alps, where the snow fell in soft, solemn waves. Inside a modest wooden cabin, Professor Harold McCain placed the envelope on the table beside a cup of steaming tea. Ayanna, now 17, sat by the window, her fingers gently tracing the worn edges of her mother's wooden flute. Without speaking, she reached for the envelope. Her fingertips brushed the raised Braille. The Artisan Prize, awarded to Ayana Bell for changing the way the world hears sound. She smiled faintly. "I'll go," she said. "But not to receive. To return." The Royal Hall in London had never hosted anything like what was about to unfold. Its vaulted ceilings had heard the voices of monarchs, operas sung in 5 languages, symphonies that took years to compose. But this time, it was the silence between those things the world had come to honor. Ayanna did not arrive with an entourage. She did not walk the red carpet. She entered through the side service door wearing a simple linen cloak. Barefoot. Holding only 2 things, her white cane and her mother's flute. No spotlight followed her. No anthem played. But when she appeared on stage, every camera in the world pointed toward her. Then, paused. Because she didn't begin with music. She bowed, not to the audience but toward the ceiling as if greeting someone invisible. Then, as the Royal Council approached with the crystal Artisan Prize statue, she accepted it briefly, only to place it gently on the podium beside her. She did not lift it. She didn't smile for the cameras. She placed her hands on the flute and began to play. It was not a grand performance. There were no crescendos. No fiery runs or dazzling scales. It was a memory. Or perhaps, a reminder. Each note of the flute seemed to hover in the air, like dust caught in light. The sound didn't explode. It simply existed, like the breath of someone who's just remembered a song from their childhood. A melody not made to impress but to heal. One of the council's oldest members, a composer in his late 80s, whispered to his neighbor, "She's not playing music. She's restoring it." At the final note, Ayanna didn't bow again. She simply walked off stage, leaving the artisan prize behind, as if it were a coat she never asked to wear. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't stand. They just sat. In silence. Because they knew they had just experienced something that words could only diminish. That very night, the Royal Council held an emergency meeting. After 3 hours, they issued a single-page statement. Effective immediately, the Artisan Prize will be renamed the Ayana Bell Honor. Not to commemorate a name, but to remind the world what it forgot. Music is not for conquering the world. It is the way we return to ourselves. Ayana vanished again. But her absence became louder than any performance. In Lisbon, a blind girl with dreadlocks was seen tapping rhythms on a park bench with a pipe. No instruments. Just hollow sound and laughter. In Peru, an 8-year-old boy discovered a Braille music score inside a mobile library van. No one had put it there. He played it on a wooden instrument, then turned to his mother and said, "I didn't see who left it. But I know they stood right here." In Ghana, drummers in the Elmina region began teaching a rhythm called the Ayanna pulse, marked by deliberate pauses, echoing the sound of steps that walked with both fear and defiance. In Syria, a refugee reported hearing a flute at 3 a.m. during an evacuation. "It wasn't just music," they said. "It felt like someone was guiding us through the dark." These stories were never verified. No press ever caught her. No one could confirm anything. But no one doubted either. Because what Ayanna had become could no longer be seen. She had turned into something the world couldn't own. An echo that moved through silence. Back at Eastbrook Conservatory, change had taken root in soil once too hard for it. Bell Wing had opened its doors not just to the exceptional, but to the excluded. Its hallways bore no portraits of prestigious alumni. Instead, it featured blank spaces with Braille inscriptions beneath them. Not for decoration, but to say, "These spaces are for the faces that were never included." Instructors were now required to attend listening literacy classes. Each semester began with 1 hour of silence. No instruments. No talking. Just breath and awareness. One student asked, "But what if I don't hear anything?" The teacher pointed to the silence between 2 notes in a score and replied, "Then you've just found your first sound." Royce came to the Bell Wing's dedication. Not as a speaker. Not as a guest of honor. Just a man in the crowd. He stood in the back, hands in his coat, sunglasses tucked into his breast pocket for the first time in years. As Harold McCain passed by, their eyes met. Harold nodded. Royce didn't say anything. But he stood there for an hour, gazing at the stone in the courtyard. The inscription etched there in Braille read, "I don't need to stand in the middle. I just need someone to begin the melody." From where I stayed silent. The first full academic year at Bell Wing welcomed over 600 students from around the world. Some had never touched an instrument. Others couldn't read or write. Many were visually impaired, hearing impaired, or lived with sensory disorders that once disqualified them from formal music education. But here they weren't required to measure up. They were simply required to feel. In one class, a student named Luis, who couldn't speak due to neurological trauma, learned to create melody by placing his ear on a wooden table while another student gently tapped rhythms with their fingertips. He called it listening through the bones. Another student, Imani, who had been born blind in Lagos, played her first chord not on a piano, but using glass bottles filled with different levels of water. The instructor wrote no notes. She simply said, "Strike what feels heavy. Strike what feels like memory." And slowly music emerged. Not symmetrical. Not perfect. But real. Each day at Bell Wing began with one recorded track played softly through the halls. Not a song, but a breath, followed by a phrase spoken by an uncredited voice. If you hear yourself, then you are no longer invisible. It was never announced who the voice belonged to, but everyone knew. In New Delhi, a quiet revolution started in a community music school, the first quiet music lab. Classes opened not with instruments, but with 5 minutes of complete silence. Students sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed. Then the teacher would ask, "What did you hear?" Some said the hum of an overhead fan. Others, the movement of their own breath. A few said nothing. Each answer became a note. Each note became a piece. And then it happened. The students stopped trying to play music. They started trying to understand it. The movement spread. To Buenos Aires. To Johannesburg. to Oslo, to Hanoi, to New Orleans. And no matter how different the people, languages, or instruments, each place began with the same phrase. What did you hear? In Boston, Nathaniel Royce, once the master of standing ovations, now played alone in a small riverside apartment. His once glorious piano, no longer polished, sat silently in the center of the room. Its keys had yellowed. The fallboard creaked when opened. He didn't play for crowds anymore. He played for regret. A Braille music score sat on his stand. He couldn't read it, but he touched the bumps each morning like prayer beads and played the melody from memory, slowly, imperfectly. Some days he cried. Some days he sat in silence. But every day he played. Once, during a rare seminar at a small conservatory, he approached Harold McCain quietly. No press. No cameras. I don't expect forgiveness, Royce said. But, if I write one piece, just one, to let her feel seen, would it matter? Harold looked up. His answer was calm, unwavering. It would matter if you write it with what you've lost. Royce never published again. But every winter, a new anonymous piece appeared in small music journals. No signature. Just a note. For the one who made the world quiet enough to feel again. Ayanna herself remained unseen. Not because she was hiding, but because she no longer needed the spotlight. In Mexico City, a teacher at a school for blind children told a story. One day a girl appeared, barefoot with long black hair and a thick coat. She said nothing. She only listened. She spent 2 weeks helping students paint rhythms with their hands using watercolors and clay. Then she left. A week later, the teacher found a handwritten score under the art cabinet. No name. No address. Just a phrase written in Spanish Braille. Begin where the silence begins. In Kyoto, at a nursing home, an elderly woman nearing her final days told the staff she once sang lullabies but couldn't remember them anymore. A music therapist found a new score sitting on the piano bench the next morning. It wasn't in the registry. It wasn't in any library. They played it for her. She smiled, closed her eyes, and said, "That's the one I forgot." In churches, orphanages, street corners, train stations, people began leaving copies of unknown scores. Small, handwritten pieces that didn't follow any known harmonic system. But when played they felt like home. They weren't from Ayanna. Or at least no one could prove it. Because no one saw her. They only felt her. At Bell Wing, one new professor, a former child prodigy turned musicologist, once asked, "Do you think Ayanna will ever return to give a lecture?" The director smiled, then pointed to a piano in the corner of the atrium. A faded sheet of music rested on the stand. The ink was uneven. Some notes incomplete. No name on it. But written across the bottom in faint Braille. You don't need a degree to be a musician. You just need the courage to play the first note. When everyone is waiting for you to fail. Winter came early in the mountains of Bhutan that year. Snow blanketed the village rooftops like quiet prayers, and in the stillness of the cold, monks at a small temple discovered something curious one morning. Hanging from the entrance gate was a parchment scroll, trembling in the breeze. There was no name, no ink signature, no seals. Just hand-pressed symbols etched lightly into the paper. At the bottom was one single line written in Braille, translated by a traveling teacher. "If you hear something within the silence, then I was once here." They placed the scroll in their shrine, not out of devotion but recognition. Somehow, without seeing her, they knew. Word spread not by broadcast or article, but through conversation. A whisper in Kenya, a song in Quebec, a pause in Indonesia. In Lisbon, a local music teacher overheard a strange harmony coming from the back of the public library. When she entered, she saw a young blind girl with long dark hair tapping soft rhythms with a shy little girl, using a plastic pipe. No instruments. No formal lesson. Just sound and giggles. "Are you Ayana Bell?" she asked cautiously. The girl paused, then smiled, but never answered. The next morning on the teacher's desk was a handwritten sheet of music. No name. No address. Just a note at the bottom. No need to know the name. Only to hear the echo. At Eastbrook Conservatory, once a citadel for the pedigreed and privileged, change had taken root in ways no one had foreseen. The original founders' portraits that lined the halls, mostly stern white men in Baroque frames, were taken down. Replaced with nothing. Empty spaces. With only small plaques underneath each reading. Reserved for those who never had their picture taken. New students came from 30 countries. Many didn't read sheet music. Some didn't even speak. And yet they played. One teacher, once skeptical, stood in awe during a final exam as 2 students, a deaf child from Nairobi and a neurodivergent girl from Poland, performed a duet entirely based on synchronized breath and shared eye contact. There was no timing, no harmony, and yet it was music. Afterward, the teacher wept. "I thought I came to teach them," he whispered. "But they're teaching me to listen again." In Paris, street performers began their shows with one ritual. They played a single note, held it, then let it fade into the sound of the crowd before continuing. When asked why, a violinist with a crooked bow answered, "It's to remind us to listen first, before we perform." In a refugee camp in Syria, a girl who had lost her family found a small wooden flute in a parcel of donated goods. Attached to it was no return label, no brand, only a line etched into the side. "For the breath you still have." She began playing. Not beautifully, but honestly. One note each morning. Two at dusk. Others joined. And from the ruins rose a chorus of children who had nothing, but had been given a sound. Meanwhile, Professor Harold McCain, now in his late 70s, lived quietly in a small house near Lake Como. Visitors came often, not for instruction but to talk. Musicians, teachers, parents of disabled children, broken artists. They came to understand what had happened. Not just to Ayanna, but to themselves. Once, in an interview with a modest podcast, Harold was asked, "How do you explain her legacy?" She vanished. He smiled, his eyes misty. "You don't explain a heartbeat. You just know it's there." Then he paused. Ayanna didn't come to be heard. She came to give others permission to make sound. That's why she disappeared. Because she wanted the world to find its own melody again. On the outskirts of Florence, a young man with autism uploaded a video to YouTube. He didn't speak in it. He simply walked through a field holding a score he'd received in the mail, a piece titled "The Echo of My Name," which had arrived with no sender, no origin. In the video, he tapped out the melody using raindrops falling into a series of ceramic bowls. At the end of the clip, a title card read, "This is how I learned to talk." The video went viral not because of its technique, but because every comment under it said the same thing. "I didn't understand it, but I felt it, and it made me feel seen." Back in Boston, Nathaniel Royce sat at the window of his apartment each evening, listening to the wind against the glass. He no longer played on stages, no longer gave interviews. He played for one audience only, himself. Every day at dawn he opened the same score, the one in Braille, and attempted the melody. Slowly, tenderly, without the arrogance of technique. And each time when he reached the final note, he whispered into the room, "I'm sorry." He never expected an answer. But the silence after his whisper no longer felt empty. It felt full. Like someone had heard him, somewhere. And in a dusty music room in a rural town outside Johannesburg, a blind student named Jolly opened a box of second-hand instruments donated by a European school. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a flute. Not expensive. Not new. Carved lightly into its shaft was a line in Braille. "Play when you're ready. Not when they tell you." Jolly didn't know who had sent it. But that night she played her first note under the stars. And as the wind carried it away, she whispered to herself. She was here. At the heart of the Bell Wing, where Eastbrook Conservatory once closed doors on those who didn't fit its mold, there now stood a single piano. No gold accents. No branding. Just wood, scratched, worn and honest. Each morning before the first lesson, a staff member pressed play on a recording. The audio was grainy, a bit rough around the edges, but no one ever asked to change it. It wasn't a famous piece. It had no name. Only a simple female voice at the end, almost a whisper. "If you can hear yourself, then you've already begun the song." Everyone believed the voice belonged to Ayana Bell. No one could prove it. But no one wanted to. Because some things are more powerful left unnamed. Elsewhere, far from any conservatory or city, in a windswept village in northern Canada, a man named Jacob ran a community center for displaced youth. One afternoon, while sorting through a package of donated books, he found a tightly wrapped envelope tucked between the pages of a tattered musical anthology. Inside was a music score. Handwritten. Unconventional. Beautiful. No title. No sender. Just a note in faint handwriting. For those who don't know what they're waiting for. That night, he gave it to a girl who refused to speak but often sat by the center's broken keyboard. She played the piece haltingly, awkward at first, but with each measure, her hands steadied. The final note rang out like a breath being released after years of being held. She turned, and for the first time in 6 months she said a word. More? Ayanna had not disappeared. She had dissolved into the rhythm of the world. You heard her in street musicians who played with cracked violins. In orphans in Bulgaria who created symphonies from spoons and kitchen pots. In schoolchildren in Lebanon who composed lullabies from footsteps and clapping. She wasn't teaching music. She was teaching permission. The last public sighting, or something close to it, came from a nurse working in a small clinic in Bhutan. She claimed that one evening, a woman with a white cane entered quietly, asked if there were any children afraid of the dark, and was brought to a room where 3 blind children lay awake. The woman said nothing. She placed her flute to her lips and began to play. The melody wasn't grand. It was a lullaby. Unfinished. Gentle. Sick. When the children finally slept, the woman tucked the flute back into her coat and walked out into the snow. The nurse followed her to the door but saw only footsteps disappearing into the white. Back in London at the Royal Council of Arts, a new room was opened next to the Hall of Laureates. It wasn't dedicated to one artist, but to a moment in history, the night the Artisan Prize was renamed. Inside, on a pedestal under glass, lay Ayanna's original flute. Next to it was a quote etched into a brass plaque. She never asked to be seen. She only asked that others be heard. In a quiet apartment in Florence, Harold McCain spent his final years writing music, not for publication but for the wind. Each score was left in train stations, public gardens, post offices. Each one titled only by emotion. When silence is louder than applause. For the child who waited. The note before the first cry. The last score he wrote before passing was found in the pocket of his coat at the hospital. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. But the last line read, "To Ayanna, who never needed my permission to begin." Back in Boston, Royce, now older, frielier, sat on a bench outside the Bell Wing. His hands shook too much to play. But each morning he still visited. He no longer wore sunglasses. He no longer introduced himself. He just sat near the stone courtyard where Ayanna's words were etched. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is where everything waits to be heard. A first-year student once approached him, holding a crumpled score. "Did you know her?" they asked. Royce looked at the paper. Nodded. "Not well enough." Then he pointed to the space between the notes. "Play that." The student frowned. "That's just a rest." "No," Royce whispered. "That's her." The world never found Ayanna again. She was seen only in glances. Felt in melodies. Known in breaths. In train platforms, where performers started with one quiet note before playing. In hospitals, where lullabies written in Braille soothed anxious mothers. In schools, where students painted their music instead of writing it. She was never verified. Never tracked. But in a remote fishing village in Chile, someone once left a handwritten sheet on a dock. It had no title. Just 5 notes. And one line of Braille at the bottom. "I only wanted one person to feel like they were no longer invisible." Ayana Bell's story is not about fame. It's not about defiance or revenge. It's about the quiet revolution that begins when someone forgotten dares to speak in a language the world doesn't expect, and teaches us all to listen again. Because sometimes the most powerful performances aren't the ones with applause. They're the ones where the world finally falls silent. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. What is the sound inside you that has never been heard? Share your answer in the comments. Subscribe to True Echo for more stories that remind us. Sometimes the most important voices are the ones no one saw coming.